I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who sat at her kitchen table at midnight, staring at a chipped coffee mug, wondering how her marriage unraveled without a dramatic explosion. No slammed doors, no screaming matches that made the neighbors raise their blinds, just this quiet, suffocating sense that something had died and neither of us wanted to bury it. When I married Daniel 12 years ago, I thought I had chosen safety. I grew up in a home where my father's temper dictated every dinner and where my mother measured her words like landmines. I promised myself that if I ever built a life with someone, it would be calm. Daniel was the definition of calm: steady, reliable, never one to pick a fight. He loved his routines: same breakfast every morning, same shirts neatly ironed, same way he kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work. For a while, I convinced myself that predictability was the foundation of love. We bought a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone waves when you drive by. Our life together was built on rituals: Sunday grocery runs, Friday night takeout, Saturday laundry. I told myself that stability was happiness, and maybe in the early years it was. But around year 7, I started noticing the silence. Not the comfortable kind where you share space with someone and feel at ease, but the kind that hums with things unsaid. Conversations became transactional. Did you pay the electric bill? What time are you getting home? Can you grab milk? If I tried to talk about feelings, he'd nod, say, "Yeah, I hear you," and then go right back to scrolling his phone. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even dismissive in a loud way. He was just absent. I carried the weight of that absence quietly at first. I convinced myself I was being dramatic, that no marriage feels like a fairy tale forever. When friends asked how we were, I said, "Good, busy," because that's what people say when they don't want to open the door to honesty. Even when intimacy faded to once every few months, I told myself it was stress, that middle age does that to people. Then one night, while I was folding laundry, I caught myself wondering what it would feel like if he just never came home. Not in a tragic way, not in some catastrophic accident. Just gone. Would I even notice aside from the bills piling up? The thought chilled me, not because it was cruel, but because it felt true. That's when I realized I wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. I was afraid of staying with him. But here's the part that complicates everything. A few months ago, I reconnected with someone from my past. His name is Eric, and we dated briefly in college before life pulled us in different directions. I hadn't thought of him in years, until I stumbled across him at a friend's backyard gathering. He looked older, of course, a little more lined around the eyes, but when he laughed, it was like no time had passed. We talked for hours that night, mostly about inconsequential things: music, jobs, the absurdities of adulthood. But there was a spark, something I hadn't felt in years. When his hand brushed mine as he passed me a drink, I felt a jolt that reminded me I was alive. For weeks afterward, I found myself replaying snippets of our conversation while I washed dishes or sat in traffic. Nothing happened, at least not physically. But emotionally, I was already somewhere dangerous. I knew it, and yet I didn't stop. We started texting. At first, casual check-ins, then longer conversations, then confessions about how stagnant we both felt in our lives. He admitted he'd gone through a messy divorce a few years back and had been questioning everything since. I told him things I hadn't told Daniel in years: my fears, my frustrations, the gnawing loneliness of lying beside someone who might as well be a stranger. And he listened. Not just the way Daniel pretended to, but fully, asking questions, remembering details, circling back to things I'd said days later. It was intoxicating. I'm not naive. I know how these stories usually end, with accusations, broken homes, kids caught in the crossfire. And maybe that's why I've been frozen in this limbo, unable to step forward, unable to step back. Because I don't just have myself to think about. We don't have kids, but we have a shared life: mortgage, joint accounts, families who think we're solid. To shatter that feels selfish, and yet the thought of continuing as we are feels unbearable. Sometimes I lie awake at night, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside me, and I wonder if he notices too. If he senses the distance, if he feels me slipping away, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's just grateful for the quiet, for the lack of confrontation. I'm caught between two versions of myself. The dutiful wife who keeps everything intact, and the woman who wants to feel alive again. I don't know how long I can balance on this edge before someone, pushes me off. The first real fracture came on a Tuesday evening, though at the time it looked so ordinary you wouldn't have noticed unless you were me. I was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills, my laptop open, and a stack of envelopes spread out. Daniel walked in from work, set his keys on the counter like he always did, kissed me absently on the top of my head, and went straight to the living room. The television clicked on within minutes, his usual routine. I stared at the stack of bills, at his shoes left carelessly in the middle of the floor, and something inside me snapped, not loudly, but like a rope fraying one thread at a time until it finally gives. I thought about how many evenings had passed this way. Me at the table managing the life we shared, him checked out in front of a glowing screen. I wanted to ask him, "Do you even see me anymore?" But I didn't. Instead, I walked into the living room and asked if he wanted to eat together. He barely looked up and said, "Yeah, whenever you're ready." It was such a small moment, but the hollowness of it broke me. I excused myself, went into the bathroom, and locked the door just to cry in silence. Not because he'd done anything wrong in that moment, but because I realized that this was my life, a string of evenings where I felt invisible in my own home. That same night, after Daniel went to bed, I found myself scrolling through my phone and opening my chat with Eric. His last message was still there from 2 days earlier. "How's your week going?" I typed back before I could think too hard. "Lonely." "You?" The 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "Same. Can't sleep lately. Too much on my mind." We ended up talking until nearly 2 a.m., our words spilling out faster than I could process them. He told me about how his divorce had blindsided him, how he'd thought he was building a life with someone who wanted the same things, only to realize she'd already checked out long before the papers were signed. I told him about the silence in my house, about how I sometimes stood in front of the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize myself anymore. When I finally put the phone down, I knew I'd crossed a line. It wasn't physical, but it was betrayal all the same. The intimacy between us was something Daniel and I hadn't shared in years, and the guilt that settled over me the next morning was heavy. I made Daniel his usual breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee, but I couldn't meet his eyes. The guilt didn't stop me, though. If anything, it drew me closer to Eric. We started calling during my lunch breaks, meeting for coffee under the guise of catching up. At first, it was innocent, 2 old friends reconnecting. But I knew what I was doing when I chose a dress I knew looked good on me, or when I put on lipstick before heading out the door. The first time we touched beyond a casual brush was at a coffee shop. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. It wasn't even overtly romantic, but the warmth of his palm against mine made my throat tighten. I pulled back quickly, afraid of what people around us might think, but the electricity lingered. Driving home that day, I couldn't shake the thought, this is what it feels like to be seen. At home, Daniel asked how my afternoon was. I lied and said I'd just run errands. He nodded, distracted, scrolling through his phone. The lie slipped out so easily I startled myself. The weeks that followed felt like living in 2 parallel realities. In one, I was the wife who kept the household running, who smiled at family gatherings, who played the role she'd been playing for over a decade. In the other, I was a woman rediscovering a part of herself she thought was gone, laughing too loudly at Eric's jokes, sharing secrets late at night, feeling that flutter in her stomach when his name lit up her screen. But cracks were starting to show. One night, Daniel asked why I'd been staying up so late. I shrugged and said I was just restless. He didn't press, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as if he was trying to read something in my expression. That's when the fear set in. Not fear of being caught, but fear of what would happen if I wasn't. Because if Daniel never noticed, What did that say about the state of our marriage? That he could watch me slip away piece by piece and not even realize I was gone? I found myself scrutinizing him in ways I never had before. Did he really not notice the extra care I was putting into my appearance lately? Did he not wonder why I smiled at my phone when I thought he wasn't looking? Or maybe he did notice and chose to ignore it, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging the chasm between us. One evening, while we were sitting at the dinner table, Daniel set his fork down and asked, "Are you happy?" The question hit me so hard I froze. For a second, I thought he knew everything. But when I looked up, his expression wasn't accusatory. It was almost weary, like he'd been carrying the weight of the same silence I had. I opened my mouth, ready to say something honest, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I smiled faintly and said, "Yeah, just tired." He nodded, went back to eating, and the moment passed. But it haunted me for days, because the truth was, I wasn't happy, and neither was he. We were both pretending, hoping maybe the act itself would be enough to sustain us. But I knew it couldn't last. Something had to give. And I was terrified it would be me who broke first. It was a Saturday morning when the world I'd been balancing on finally tipped. The kind of morning that should have been routine. Grocery list scribbled on the counter, laundry tumbling in the dryer, Daniel mowing the lawn with his usual quiet determination. But I had plans I didn't tell him about. Eric and I had agreed to meet at a small trail outside town. It wasn't far, just a walking path lined with trees and a little stream that wound its way through the woods. Neutral ground, safe enough to pass off as just friends if anyone saw us. At least, that's what I told myself. When I pulled into the lot, he was already there, leaning against his car with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. The sight of him made my heart race in a way that felt reckless, like I was a teenager sneaking out after curfew. We walked side by side, talking about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing easily as it always did. But the air between us was charged. Every brush of his arm against mine, every glance that lingered too long, it was all heavy with unspoken tension. At one point we stopped at the stream. He skipped a stone across the water and then turned to me. His voice was quieter than before. "Do you ever feel like you've been living someone else's life?" The question hit me hard. I wanted to say every damn day. Instead, I just nodded. He looked at me in that way he does, like he's pulling thoughts straight from my chest. And then he reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, and left his hand resting there just a beat too long. That was the moment. The point where I could have stepped back, reminded him, and myself, that I was married. But I didn't. I let him lean in, and when his lips brushed mine, I kissed him back. It wasn't a wild, sweeping kiss. It was tentative, searching. But it unraveled something in me I hadn't realized was wound so tight. For the first time in years, I felt wanted. Not tolerated, not coexisting, but wanted. The guilt hit almost immediately, sharp and cold, even as my heart pounded with the thrill of it. I pulled away, breathless. "I can't." He didn't push. He just nodded, his eyes steady. "I know, I'm sorry." But the damage was done. A line had been crossed, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. Driving home, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept rehearsing what I'd say if Daniel asked where I'd been. He didn't. When I walked in, sweaty from mowing, he just gave me a quick smile and asked if I'd picked up groceries. That night, lying beside him in bed, the contrast was unbearable. On one side, a man who had shared over a decade of my life, who had given me stability and a roof over my head, who had never raised his voice at me. On the other side, just out of reach, was a man who reminded me of everything I used to dream about, everything I thought I'd sacrificed for security. I couldn't sleep. My mind spun in endless circles, caught between loyalty and longing, fear and desire. I got up, padded into the kitchen, and sat at the table in the dark, just staring at the glow of the streetlight outside. That's when I heard footsteps. Daniel came in, rubbing his eyes. "You okay?" "I couldn't sleep," I said, forcing a smile. He studied me for a moment, then sat down across from me. His face was tired, but not in the usual way. This was something else. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "We don't talk much anymore, do we?" The words pierced me. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "I guess not." He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what happened to us. I feel like we're roommates half the time. And I don't know if that's normal or if it's us." I should have confessed right then. Told him about the texts, the kiss, the ache in my chest every time I thought about Eric. But instead, I swallowed it all down and nodded. "I feel that too." We sat in silence for a long time. Then he said something that unsettled me more than anything. "Sometimes I wonder if we'd both be happier apart." The words hung in the air like smoke. I stared at him, trying to read if he meant them, if he was testing me, if he was offering me an escape. But his face was unreadable. Part of me wanted to agree, to say yes, maybe we should face the truth and end this quietly before we destroyed each other. But another part of me panicked at the thought of dismantling everything we'd built, of admitting that 12 years had led us here. So I did what I always do. I deflected. "Maybe we just need to try harder," I whispered. He nodded slowly, as if he didn't quite believe me, but he didn't push further. That night, as he drifted back to sleep beside me, I realized something chilling. Daniel already knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew I wasn't fully here anymore. And instead of fighting for me, he was bracing himself for the possibility of letting me go. And for reasons I couldn't yet untangle, that hurt worse than anything. After that night in the kitchen, nothing looked the same, though on the surface everything carried on as usual. Daniel still went to work in the mornings, still left his shoes by the door, still asked me if I needed anything when he ran errands. But there was a shift in his eyes, like he had pulled back behind a wall, watching me from a distance instead of reaching for me. And me? I was unraveling quietly, a piece at a time. I tried to throw myself into routines, cooking dinner, cleaning, ticking off chores on weekends. Like if I held the house together, maybe it would glue the marriage back in place. But the hollowness only grew. I couldn't stop thinking about Eric. The kiss replayed in my mind with brutal clarity. Not because it was scandalous, but because of how gentle it had been. He had looked at me like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. That single look was more intimate than years of polite pecks on the forehead from Daniel. We didn't meet again right away. After that kiss, there was a pause, an unspoken understanding that we'd gone too far. But the distance didn't hold. The texts resumed, slower at first, then tumbling into their old rhythm, and before long I was sneaking away during lunch hours just to hear his voice. One afternoon, I sat in my car outside the office, phone pressed to my ear, listening to him laugh. "You sound lighter," he said. "Do I?" I asked. "Yeah, happier." He paused. "It makes me wonder what you'd be like if you weren't stuck in something that weighs you down." The words sank into me like stones. I wanted to argue, to defend the life I'd chosen, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. That evening, when I came home, Daniel was sitting at the table with a pile of envelopes spread out in front of him. His expression was tight, strained. "We need to talk about money," he said. I braced myself. He went through the bills, the balances, the way expenses were creeping up. But I could feel it wasn't really about money. It was about control, about holding together a life that was slipping through his fingers. I listened, nodded in the right places, but all I could think was, this is what our marriage has become. Numbers on a page, logistics to be managed, no spark left to carry us through. Later that night, while he was showering, my phone buzzed with a message from Eric. "I wish I could see you right now." I stared at it, heart racing. For a long moment, I hovered over the keyboard. Then, impulsively, I typed back, "Tomorrow?" We met at a motel on the edge of town. I told myself I wasn't going to let it happen, that I'd just talk to him, clear my head, maybe even say goodbye. But when he opened the door and pulled me into his arms, All the restraint I'd been clinging to crumbled. I don't need to spell out what happened next. All I can say is that it wasn't reckless or hurried the way people imagine affairs to be. It was tender, slow, almost mournful, like two people who had both been starving and finally let themselves eat. Afterward, I lay there with my head on his chest, feeling his heartbeat under my ear, and the guilt came crashing down. Not guilt for the act itself. I'd been betraying Daniel long before this, but guilt for how alive I felt in that moment. Because I knew, without question, that I couldn't unknow this feeling. I couldn't go back to silence and half smiles and routines that felt like prison bars. I drove home in a fog, the weight of what I'd done pressing on me. When I walked through the door, Daniel was sitting on the couch watching television, same as always. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked how my day was. I mumbled something about errands and escaped to the bathroom, where I locked the door and sank to the floor, trembling. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, his back turned to me, I realized something devastating. I wasn't waiting to fall out of love with Daniel. I already had. The only thing left was the shell of what we'd built, and even that was starting to crack. But here's the twist I didn't see coming. A week later, Daniel sat me down after dinner. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them on the table. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. My heart stopped. For a split second, I thought he knew about Eric, that this was the confrontation I'd been dreading. But then he took a deep breath and continued. "I've been talking to someone." The world tilted. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because I didn't deserve it, but because I hadn't imagined he might be drifting too. I just stared at him, numb, as he explained. A woman from his office. Nothing physical, he insisted, just conversations. But the way he spoke about it, the shame in his voice, the hesitation, told me it wasn't as innocent as he wanted me to believe. For years I'd thought of myself as the one carrying the loneliness, the one silently breaking. But sitting there across from him, I realized we had both been starving, both reaching for scraps of connection wherever we could find them. And suddenly, the story I'd been telling myself, that I was the one betraying, the one slipping away, crumbled. Because the truth was, we were both already gone. I didn't scream when Daniel told me. I didn't throw anything, didn't demand names or timelines. Instead, I sat in silence, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and stared at the wood grain of the table. It was surreal, hearing him confess what I myself had been hiding. Part of me wanted to laugh at the symmetry of it all, two people living under the same roof, each secretly feeding on scraps of affection elsewhere, both too scared or stubborn to admit how broken we'd become. When he finished talking, there was a long pause. Finally, I asked, "Do you love her?" His eyes widened. "Number God, no, it's not like that." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know how it started. She just listened. I didn't realize how much I missed that." The words cut deeper than he realized, because that was exactly what Eric had been for me, a pair of ears, a reminder that I still existed. It wasn't about grand passion or lust, not at first. It was about being seen. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I had done the same, but the words caught in my throat. I was terrified of what would happen if we laid it all bare. Would it free us, or would it destroy us completely? For the next few days, the house felt heavy with unspoken truths. We moved around each other like ghosts, polite but distant. Meals were eaten in silence, television hummed in the background, and at night we lay in the same bed but worlds apart. One evening I came home to find him sitting in the living room with a suitcase half packed beside him. My stomach dropped. "I'm going to stay with my brother for a while," he said quietly. "I think we need space." I nodded slowly, though my chest felt like it was collapsing. "Okay." He studied me for a long moment. "Is there something you want to tell me?" My pulse raced. This was it, the opening, the chance to be honest. I could have confessed everything right then, the texts, the coffee shop, the motel. But looking at his tired face, I couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, I whispered, I don't know where we went wrong. His shoulders slumped. Me neither. And then he left. Just like that. A decade of shared life reduced to a suitcase and a hollow goodbye. The first night alone in the house, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even freedom. Instead, I felt untethered, like I was floating in some vast emptiness. Eric texted me not long after. How are you holding up? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. He moved out. His response came quickly. Do you want to come over? I almost did. My keys were already in my hand when I stopped, because as much as I craved the warmth of his presence, I knew running straight into his arms would be a mistake. It would mean using him as an escape hatch instead of facing the wreckage of my marriage. And maybe, deep down, I needed to sit with the emptiness first. The days blurred. Friends called to check in. Family members offered vague reassurances, but I kept most of the truth to myself. It was easier to say, we're taking some time apart, than to admit the deeper rot that had eaten away at us. A week later, Daniel came back. Not to move in, but to talk. We sat at the same kitchen table where so much of our unraveling had happened. He looked older somehow, worn down. I think we should be honest, he said. My heart pounded. About what? About everything, he replied. He took a deep breath. I wasn't faithful. Not in the way that counts. And I don't think you were either. The words hung between us like a mirror. My eyes filled with tears. No, I whispered. I wasn't. There it was. The truth. Raw and undeniable. Neither of us were innocent. Neither of us had been enough for the other anymore. We talked for hours that night. Not accusations, not shouting, just the slow, painful excavation of all the things we'd buried for years. How we'd stopped listening, how routines had replaced connection, how fear of conflict had strangled intimacy. By the end, we both knew what needed to happen. Divorce. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but as acknowledgement that the life we built together had run its course. When he left that night, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel grief in the way I expected. What I felt was clarity, a kind of quiet acceptance that sometimes marriages don't end with explosions. They end with silence, with slow drifting, until one day you wake up and realize you're already living separate lives. I don't know what my future with Eric looks like. Maybe it will fade once the intensity of secrecy is gone. Maybe it will grow into something real. Or maybe I'll discover that I need time alone to figure out who I am outside of being someone's wife. What I do know is this. I can't go back to being invisible. I can't go back to folding laundry in silence, pretending the ache in my chest is just married life. So here I am, standing on the edge of something unknown. Scared, yes. Guilty, yes. But also, for the first time in a very long time, alive.